one of the things a lot of people have asked for is a one light setup. They're going to follow a bit more of a rough and ready kind of format. So it's going to be a bit more like a live stream. It's much more about the principle that we're trying to look at. And I hope that gives you an idea, and then we'll kind of jump into it. So I've got then 6 different variations you could work through with one light setup. Down here where it says studio tour. And the reason that this is black is because there's no studio light in place at this point. So what we're looking at is kind of what the ambient light of the room would be. And let's have a tour of the studio space. So I've marked this out here. This is our camera. This is our model. We're about 5 meters away. 85mm prime lens, got a shutter speed 1125, ISO 400, and aperture f11. We're going to keep it pretty much f11 all the way through this setup, and let's just spin around the room. So I've got a bit of a set that I've built. This is just like a flat wall, and then I've got a drape or a curtain, which I've changed the color of here, and then I've got a red color armor on them. And then I've chosen some like fairly strong colors for the model's outfit, because it's important to see what happens as the light changes, how those colors become more vivid or how they play off against each other. So the height of the studio is 5 meters. 10 meters long, 10 meters wide. Not using the whole studio space. There's a distance between the 2 curtains. It's like about 6 meters. So it's a fairly standard studio space. So this is just variations of what you could do with one light. We've got image preview there. We've got the top-down view, and then obviously we've got what we see in the studio. So let's go to our first setup, bare reflector. And what's important about this is it's placed pretty much above the camera. So it's like over the photographer's shoulders, pointing straight at the model. Open face reflector. And I don't have any grid. Power is 5.2. And we get a good idea what's happening even with just the modeling light, because it's fairly realistic. Okay, so what we'd expect with this, because it's an open source reflector, there's no grid on it, we're going to throw a big area of light somewhere here. We're going to get some light that bounces off different areas, but it's not really going to affect our overall image or exposure. Well, model is stood a little bit away from the background, and the light is going to bounce a little bit off here. It's going to fill in that shadow a little bit, but it's just throwing a shadow onto the wall. And because the light is up high, that shadow is just dropping down below the eye lines. And this is just like an easy setup that you could shoot a whole bunch of portraits or fashion editorial shots. It's quick. You wouldn't have to worry too much about what's happening with the fabric changing, material changing of the clothing. It's just a very simple basic lighting setup. We're throwing that light without any diffusion, so we're getting a lot of light bouncing off the edge of the handbag here. It's bouncing off the leather of the skirt. So anything that's going to push light back and make a shine, that's going to be really pronounced. Because the light is quite far away, it's going to wrap around the model a little bit. It's also going to bounce off this edge here. So it's not going to be like a super hard line or hard edge to the shadow, but it's going to bring out the contrast of those colors. What I do now is just I put a grid on here so we can just see the difference. I'm not going to render this one out, but I'm just going to change it to a grid. We've got everything from a 4, which is quite a wide open grid, and then to a really tight grid here. So let's put a tight grid on. Let's view the preview of that. So we can see with that tight grid on, we need a lot more power in the light because we're cutting so much out and we're only really getting the middle of it. Put the power up on that grid. Now you can see where the center of the light is. A really tight grid from this far away because it's pushing into the middle of the image. It's not really doing what we need it to do. But let's just kind of cheat this and let's just bring it up to the face. And then we can see the difference. The power is a little bit too high now, so we know to bring this power deck down. Let's just put it on like 6.3, images side by side, so we get a rough idea of what's happening. And the exposure on the face is fairly consistent, right? We could tweak it, we could get it better. But for now, we could see actually, if we want to make something that's bringing the face forward, then we need to put a grid onto it. But if we want to just throw light into the overall image, then we could do it without the grid. And maybe we need something in between. But this is just about one light, it's not about layering lights. Go to our next setup. So everything in the set is going to stay the same. The camera position is always going to stay the same in this setup. It's important just so that we're always comparing like for like. I think the easiest way to understand studio lighting is not change too many variants at any one time. We're keeping the f-stop the same. That's important to remember. Let's just zoom under this so that we can see. We've got a big umbrella with a white interior to it. So we have options in this program to change it to black silver or to black white. Here we've got white, so the head is bouncing up into the umbrella and then it's spreading out here, so the light will kind of bounce down onto the floor, bounce back up into the model, but it's quite a big light source that is from above. So you see it's a large umbrella, so it's a 2.10 m, ever so slightly angled forward. So what we'd expect with that is overall the light should be a lot softer, it should be more even with the shadow, these two together. So this is mimicking a little bit more sort of a soft daylight. It could be like a top window light, skylight, for example. It's not like perfect with that, but the light in the face is softer. There isn't this like heavy shadow across here, which we're seeing in this first image, which is kind of like pinning the model to the wall. And the overall movement from light to shade is smoother in this image than it is with the reflector. And then the other things to notice, this corner, this edge here, is a lot heavier and it's more shadow to it because we're not throwing light directly at it. It's better. So like I said, the light is kind of bouncing down, it's going to bounce up into this area. So not so much light is hitting this kind of corner. Power on this, if I didn't do that already, it's 7.6. Power when we are throwing the light direct from the open reflector was like 5.3. So let's just bring that down to 5.3. So yeah, you can see in a preview image here, because it's not a direct light source and because we're bouncing it into the ground, 5.3 is not enough light. Let's put it at 6.3. It's getting there, but it looks a little bit under. And then let's put it somewhere around 7. And that'll probably be a good enough exposure for what we need. It's also with this bounce light, it's a little bit more of a shaping light, right? It's got a bit more of a 3D feel to it because we've got light that's kind of falling down across the body, whereas this one, it's flattening everything off with that very direct light source that we have. Let's go to this one, open reflecting. So all I've done here is that open reflector that was behind the camera, I've just moved it around and brought it over to this position. So what we're doing is it's an open reflector, there's no grid, 5.6 in the power, so similar power as before, but we're pushing the light across and then we're putting it into these white polyboards. So these are just bounce boards, foam core. I've got like a book version of this, so I'm bouncing light back in towards the model. The other thing to notice, if we just go from overhead, is that this beam of light is just clipping on the edge here. And it's like that on purpose because I want that spread of light to actually just hit the model directly as well as getting this bounce light. And this is where positioning becomes really important because this line here, this very direct light source on the ground, that's being caused by the light clipping the edge of our set. So let's just look at it from the top again. Let's turn the studio light right down so you can see what I mean. Spread of light is clipping across here. It's making this hard line on the floor and then light is falling off here. So it's very much about positioning this light so it's hitting the model as well as actually that bounce light. Put the studio light back up so here so you can see that line. I mean, this direct light source on the face and then we're getting this bounce light source when the light's bouncing into those polys and coming back and filling in. We've turned it into almost a 2 light sources. And we can really test that to see where that light is spilling. We'll keep the reflector the same. We're just gonna put a grid on here. So now we're gonna stop that clip and spill across here. We're just pushing the light directly into the reflector. Preview image, that we've lost that clip light that's coming across, that direct light that was hitting the model's face. So just a summary of that, we've got power 5.6, we've got open reflector, no grid, bouncing into these white polys, but we've also got this light that's directly hitting the model source, which we can see just on the face here and we can see on the floor. But then just to test that, what I could do is I could take these 2 polyboards out so we can see the difference. That's exactly what we've done here. I've just removed it. Everything else has stayed the same. Let's just go and render that so we can see it. And then we can compare the 2 together. So obviously on the left-hand side is where the light is going into those 2 white polyboards. And then on this side is where we don't have those 2 white polyboards. Again, this is just a basic starting point. You would want to refine these things, but just showing actually with 1 light and maybe 2 polyboards, I can have a complete different effect as if I've just got the 1 light. So what we've got on this one is we've got this open reflector. I've moved it forward, so half the distance between the model and the camera now, and I've put a grid number 3, closing down that area of light. The spread of light, as you can see also from the preview image, it's a little bit more centered. So we may want to raise that light, lift it up in height, or just change the angle of it. So maybe it's more about the face. And then on this side, I've just got something as like a negative fill. So it's a black polyboard essentially. It's just this grid on. It's not super important that we have that, but it will help us a little bit if we need it to later to stop light spilling off any other areas. Preview image of that. Pair it with that first one. So behind the camera, open reflector, no grid. And then this is moving the light in half the distance and putting grid number 3 on. Suddenly this is more dramatic. Shadow is more intense, it's showing a part of the picture, whereas before the shadow is sort of a bit nothing. And by changing the angle slightly, we're bringing the shadow in a way that is maybe interesting. Again, we would refine this and put the shadow where we want it to be, but it just gives us a bit more to play with. But we could look at this and go, oh, it's too hot. Maybe we need to turn the power of the light down, or maybe we just change the angle. So let's just change the angle a little bit. We'll just zoom in so you can see exactly what I'm doing. We bring this up, not too much, somewhere like that. Instead of 5.2, we know it's pretty hot in the center, so let's just bring it down. And suddenly the exposure is a lot better. It's fine on the skirt here, but actually we're drawing emphasis back into the face by just lifting that light up. But the other thing that we could do, let's just swing it across a little bit. And just watch that preview on the other side. So it's just really dependent on where you want to put that light. Sometimes you want to have your lights quite direct, and if you're using grids, you probably will use them quite direct, but also you can push across them. And again, watch what happens to that shadow. Let's just make something of the shadow, bring it around, and render that shot. So now the shadow is a little bit separated, and it's just doing something else with the image. Gives us another variation. And then we've got a different setup. We've got, again, that bare reflector. We don't need a grid on it. We've got it open this time. We've got our 2 white polyboards that we had before, and we're just going to be pushing them through a gap. gap. I'll turn this ambient light of the studio right down. So this is now just the light source that we're seeing in the image is our strobe light. Crisp edge here. Some of the light is going to bounce off these boards back out, but that doesn't matter. It's back up again. See the power on this is 5.4. So now we've got something kind of dramatic with the shadow. The shadow is maybe interesting again. We could make it better. It's a little bit hot here on the skirt. It's that direct light. There's no grid, there's no diffusion or anything. It's just pushing through the gap. We could bring it down in power. We could change the angle slightly, but it's a fairly dramatic lighting. The other thing is to notice, like, look at the difference between the backdrop here, like previous image. So we can transform our set really quickly by just pushing the light through, say, these polyboards. You may have a particular reason that you want to do this. Maybe it's a moody portrait that you want to get. If you're in a kind of ugly space and you think, actually, I don't want that back wall, I can still like block the light and flag the light off somehow. Let's just take one of these out. And now we're just flagging it on one side. Even though it's a white polyboard, it's going to block that light. Just move it around again so we can see. Let's bring the studio lights down again. So we've got this hard edge here. It's stopping the light hitting that curtain and that backdrop. We haven't completely shut down the light because some of the light is still going to bounce around. We don't have that grid on and we've got a very direct light source, but it's just useful to see what you can do with that. It's a small gap that we've got and we could really exaggerate it. Okay, so now we've got a fairly soft light on the face because we've staggered that gap slightly. Interesting shadow on the wall. We've got a little bit of light hitting the backdrop. Let's turn that studio light right down. You see that overlap of the polyboards is allowing a little bit of this kind of like diffused bounce light. Let's do this also now with some black negative fill. And again, we've staggered this slightly. I'll bring the studio light right down. This reflector here, we don't have any grid in it. We don't need it because we're using it as an open face, but we're pushing the light pretty much into this black poly here. And we're just letting a bit of the light kind of come through. And we're clipping the edge of this polyboard. We can see it perfectly. That studio light, let's just bring the studio lights back up. So again, we're now allowing a little bit of light onto the background, got a strong shadow, and then we've got light onto the face. So we can transform our space really quite quickly. So just to kind of recap, we've got some very simple setups here. So let's just zoom out again. We started with this behind the camera, fairly flat, direct light source, bit of a shadow on the wall, not doing anything particularly exciting, but you could shoot a bunch of shots like this all day. And if the outfit's changing or the model's changing, it'll be fine. You get kind of good coverage with, and then by bringing that light back in, so we've like halved the distance of it, we've got something more dramatic and more punchy. And we put the grid into this. So then we've got something that's a different feeling again, but just by pushing that light closer, we could bring our light to the side and we could push it across the model and bounce into those polyboards, which is giving us one soft look, but with a clip light. We could take away those polyboards to give us this real edgy kind of feel. And we could go from the other side and push the light directly into the model through a small gap. So we're getting that exposure on the front, which is nice, but everything else is dropping back out. And you could play around with the position of these. And then we had that big bounce umbrella. So quite a few simple setups with just one light, with the set staying the same, camera position the same, 6 like fairly simple setups. Quite a bit of variation between them. Again, we want to refine them, but we've got a difference of something that's really quite soft in the middle. We've got something that has a softer feeling, but it's got a 2 light source feel to it because it's got that light that's pushing across. Interesting shadow that we could begin to play with, and we could play with silhouette and shape. We've managed to get the background to disappear. We've managed to include some of the background, but also get a nice shadow that we can play with and make something more dramatic that maybe works with the posing. And then we've got this pushed in shot here where we're pinning like the shadow against the wall and making a very direct feel. And then you can just really work on posing or what you want to kind of put into your image and how you want to change the shape and the feel of the image. Also, it's worth looking at like what changes in the way of contrast here and how do these colors play against each other. But it's just worth thinking at, if I only got one light, what can I do? What can I play with? Hopefully that's helpful. If this format works, let me know in the comments. If you want to see way more refined, that's okay. We can also do that, but it might take me a little bit longer. And thank you for watching.